So imagine it's during World War II, and you are a South Korean girl who is being forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. This is what was taking place so long ago for so many South Korean girls. Many of these women did not marry. Many of these women lived in silence because of the stigma. It wasn't until the early 1990s that they spoke out. The dispute between Japan and South Korea may have been agreed upon with an apology and a financial payment, but to the comfort women, the Japanese government still has not accepted legal responsibility. So the issue, South Korea women being forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II. So we're first going to look at a statement that was an agreement that was reached in December 2015 between Japan and South Korea. Then we'll look at the Kono Statement, K-O-N-O, and that statement acknowledged military involvement. And we'll briefly look at the U.S. view on this subject. And lastly, we'll look at the most recent news related to the sex slavery agreement. Most of us today were not present during World War II. Some of us were, but it's still making headlines today. There was an article from the New York Times in December of 2015. Japan and South Korea settle dispute over wartime comfort women was the headlines. And in this article, they talked about the agreement that was reached on December 28, 2015 between Japan and South Korea. And in this agreement, Japan promised $8.3 million payment, and they offered an apology. This payment went into South Korea's government to establish a foundation. Those funds were to be utilized to provide care for the women that were involved. 238 women came forward, and of those, there's only 46 that are still living. Historians say that there was tens of thousands of women, though, that was forced into to work or coerced or lured to work into brothels in the early 1930s until 1945. In this article, Lee Young-soo, she was a former comfort woman who's now 88 years old. She made a statement, and I quote, "We are not craving money. What we demand is that Japan make official reparations for the crime that it committed," end quote. In front of the Japanese embassy, there sits a statue of a young girl, a teenage girl, who is barefoot and no smile on her face. And this statue represents the Korean sex slaves. This statue was placed in 2011 by a civic group. There was a Chicago Tribune article that was released in 2015, December of 2015, that also talked about this agreement that was made. But in this article, they got a quote from Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. And he made a statement, and I quote, "We made a final and irreversible solution at this 70th anniversary milestone." This Chicago Tribune article also got a statement from Lee Young-soo, who was a former comfort woman. And in this article, she stated, and I quote, "I don't think comfort women victims were even considered," unquote, in this resolution. The article goes on to say that Tokyo thought that the dispute had been settled with the 1965 treaty, that normalized relations with South Korea and offered $800 million in compensation. Japan offered an apology in 1993 called the Kono Statement, K-O-N-O, and this statement basically acknowledged that there was military involvement. Another Chicago Tribune article from April of 2015 captured Senator Marco Rubio. And on April 26th, he had called out the Prime Minister of Japan and asked him to fully acknowledge his nation's role in forcing women into sex servitude for Japanese troops during World War II. Prime Minister Abe responded with, and I quote, that he was deeply pained, unquote, when thinking about these women, but he did not offer an apology. Abe went on to say that Japan contributed $34 million toward sexual violence against women and efforts aimed at reducing that. The latest article related to the sex slave agreement was from Japan Times, August 30th of 2016. Headlines read, South Korea faces lawsuit over sex slave agreement as dozen survivors run. And in this article, it reveals that 12 South Korean women came forward and made a lawsuit against their own government. And in this lawsuit, against their own government for signing the agreement between Japan in 2015. In this lawsuit, each of the women were asking for $90,000. South Korea Foreign Ministry said that part of the money from the foundation would be used for individual financial assistance, providing $90,000 to each survivor and $18,000 for the kin of the survivors. The offer was rebuffed by some of the comfort women who object Japanese government refusal to accept legal responsibility. In conclusion, the dispute between Japan and South Korea may have been agreed upon with an apology and a financial payment, but to the comfort women, the Japanese government still has not accepted legal responsibility. So from the 1965 treaty to the 1993 Kono Statement to the recent agreement, World War II sex slaves are still making headlines today.